Professor,
市川先生、ありがとうございました。
come to Tokyo and address your conference. I'm going to talk about London, and I'm going to talk I'm sorry, you've loaded the wrong presentation up. So you apologize, the wrong presentation is here. This one takes about an hour and a half, which is a bit too long, so if you excuse me, we'll just reload. Thank you for your patience. That's the nightmare introduction to any talk. Anyway, I'm going to talk about London. I'm going to talk about intensification. And intensification is probably the one word that sums up the policies guiding London at the moment. London is a global city. It's ambitious. It's growing. And we made a decision quite a long time ago that London wasn't going to continue outwards. It wasn't going to sprawl into the countryside, and therefore it had to basically recycle land, recycle infrastructure, and get bigger and get denser and become more intense. I'm going to talk about 4 projects which I've been involved in. The London Olympics, and on the back of that, how we try to push the energy out to the other areas of East London. I'm going to talk about intensification on the central London sites, focusing on King's Cross. And finally, I'm going to look at micro projects, all the other small things you need to do to make life better in a denser and intensified city. But this is the basic map of London, where the developable land, the opportunity, is in the east, where we had the old industry and the docklands. We have had some successes. This is the Canary Wharf development, now London's second business district, its financial centre. 30 years ago, this was disused, derelict dockland. But when you move further east, you have this kind of condition. We have an awful lot of land. We have low density. We have contaminated land. We have old infrastructure. And the whole reason for bidding for the Olympics for 2012 was to use the Olympics as a catalyst to try and pull investment and pull interest into this very, very difficult area of the city to develop. We also said that London was going to be the most sustainable games. The Olympics, by definition, is not a sustainable event. But there were 2 things which underpinned the London bid. The first was we focused it in possibly the poorest and most deprived part of the city because we wanted it to be a catalyst to change those conditions, change the opportunities of people living in that area for the better, and to revitalize East London. And secondly, we deliberately chose brownfield land, land which had had previous development on it, to change it, to bring it back into use, but to also use the infrastructure and the capacity that we had. Part of this strategy was to make a very, very compact Olympics. This is the same scale of London compared with Beijing. So a compact campus in East London with other facilities spread widely across the rest of London as a capital. And here, I've got the pointer here. Here on the right, the red area is the area of the Olympics. The grey area is central London. And by chance, we had a juxtaposition in East London of deprivation, contaminated land, opportunity, but also very significant public transport capacity. And it meant that the London Olympics did not have to spend large amounts of money and have a long lead-in period to provide transport infrastructure, which would have been extremely costly and would have taken us a long time on the program. This is the area. and very, very typical of the conditions in East London, areas of old industry, very, very poorly functioning industry, and highly contaminated land. We had to assemble the land. We had to assemble nearly 90 hectares of land. We relocated every business to new premises. We didn't extinguish a single business, so we cleared the land. And over the course of the land, we had to deal with this, very, very typical conditions. It was a part of London that we used to dump our rubbish. So over the site, we had to dig out roughly 4 meters of topsoil, cleanse it and recycle it and reuse it. We had to do a huge cleanup and decontamination of the site to prepare it as a development platform. And then we had to build a completely new physical topography, a new landform, and a completely new set of infrastructures around power, around water, around drainage, before we could even start. And as you know, in Tokyo, a period of 6 years between winning a bid and opening the games is a very, very challenging time period for any city. We had 3 master plans for the Olympics. This is the first one. This was prepared by Allies of Morrison, the firm which I work for. And this is the master plan that guided the development of the Olympics as a games venue. It had a series of stadia. This is the athletic stadium. It's not as beautiful as the one you'll build in Tokyo. It's not as beautiful as Beijing, but this contains 10% of the structure of the steel in the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing. So a lot of our strategy was around being very, very careful on our design and on the sustainability of our design practices. Secondly, every stadium had a plan to reuse it. As a nation, we didn't need an 80,000-seater athletic stadium, so the stadium is capable of being dismantled and reduced to being a 25,000-seater stadium. Every Olympic venue has a plan for its dismantling, movement, or reuse as part of a long-term sustainable strategy. And the games opened, and I hope you enjoyed them. We certainly enjoyed them in London. I hope you enjoy your games in Tokyo. It is a great event for a city to host. We then had a second master plan, and this is the transition master plan, which we've just completed. We deliberately closed down the entire park for 2 years while we adapted and dismantled and prepared a long-term development platform. And then we had a third master plan, which, again, Allies of Morrison are the master planners for. And this tries to tackle this really difficult problem for a city. You build an Olympic Games as a secure specialist games campus, but you don't want it after the Games. What you want is to explode it to become an organic piece of city for urban growth to happen. And this was the kind of our starting point in addressing the questions of legacy. We looked at other cities. We didn't think Atlanta had legacy sorted. We didn't think Athens had done it very, very well. And we thought there were lessons here. We did think Barcelona had done it well. And we thought there are lessons about thinking, about embedding the planning for the legacy in the planning for the Games. We worked on 6 very, very simple spatial strategies. The first was to retain elements of the Games as a memory, which could actually form a structure for future planning. The second was to deliberately construct a set of neighborhoods reflecting the settlement patterns of London. The third was to improve connectivity and build a structure of roads and streets, again, very much on the basis of London's structure. The fourth was to use open space, the fifth, water, and the sixth was to aspire to producing a very complex piece of city which would have built in its planning its ability to adapt and change over time. We're working on this at the moment, but the first legacy projects are now emerging, deliberately designed on a relatively low scale. We're very interested in sort of 6 to 8 stories rather than 30 to 40 stories. We think that is a legacy which suits the area and will form a very sustainable neighborhood where families will come and live, children will grow up, and people can work in a very, very high quality environment. And this is the sort of final legacy master plan. This will take us through for the next 15 years of development. And I suppose the objective is to produce a piece of city that blends seamlessly with its surroundings, but also to produce a piece of city that tackles the social and the economic deprivation of its area and gives the opportunities for people to change their lives as a result of the Olympics Games. And that's the objective for the Olympics, and that's why we bid for it. We also want to use it as a catalyst for change, and this is the area quite close to the Olympics. The Olympics is here in London, and this is the Royal Docks area. A huge opportunity, quite close to the central business district and to Canary Wharf. But for some reason, development and the property market had always ignored this. And we started working on this about 3 years ago. And the first thing we observed was we counted 73 master plans in the last 40 years for this piece of London. So the move was to just scrap them. Master plans without the ability to implement do not achieve change. What we produced instead was a very slim document, which was a narrative. This was a story. This was a story about what this piece of London could be, and critically, we got all the politicians from different parties to sign it and to sign up for it. So we achieved a political consensus, and we achieved a simple story. The idea was to try and focus development around the emerging environmental industries. We called it a green enterprise district. This is a branding exercise, and I make no apology for that, but it's to try and tell a story that people might respond to and see it in a positive light in terms of development. Because we had a story, we could bring the main landowners together and get them involved in a grand alliance to try and realize change. We could then start to agree a common vision, and we could then start to produce master plans that were rooted in a political reality which would see change which had eluded us here for the last 30 years. And on the back of this, people like Siemens have moved in with their headquarters for environmental research. We've constructed a new cable car to link across the Thames. And now this is a scheme which has just received consent and will be starting later this year, a major new business park with a Chinese investor, looking almost as the kind of the toehold in the European market for Chinese firms wishing to expand. So that's just the story of the Olympics. Elsewhere in London, intensification means more or less the same, but on a far tighter, smaller scale. The London plan identifies a whole series of small areas where we think we can focus change and get the economic growth without expanding the city outwards. The London plan also has a clear relationship that growth can happen in areas of high public transport accessibility. This is the transport accessibility map for London, and it basically focuses growth in areas where we don't have to invest in costly transport systems, but where we have capacity. And to increase capacity, we are now constructing a new major metro system to link Heathrow Airport with the city into the east, to unlock the development potential and redraw the map of London and allow development to happen in a focused and a concentrated manner. And one of the sites which has already been picked up is Battersea Nine Elms. This is very typical of one of our intensification sites, a mixture of high-rise, medium-rise and low-rise, exploiting a plan along the banks of the river. And in this case, the prerequisite is that the developers will be funding a new metro link to sort out the public transport accessibility in this part of London. This is the second site. This is the King's Cross site. To orientate you, this is central London, this is Buckingham Palace and Parliament. So King's Cross is a kind of critical site, a huge opportunity in central London, but again, in development terms, has always been seen on the periphery of what would be attractive. A major site between two stations. This is the high-speed rail link through to continental Europe, to Paris, Brussels, and next year through to Germany. And the site here was unlocked by the construction of the high-speed rail links. We started looking at this, and this might well sound counterintuitive for a city interested in intensification. King's Cross set out to become another piece of London, to be of a human scale. Deliberately, we studied parts of our city. We decided that sort of 8, 10, 12 stories was about the right kind of scale to make a very, very good and very, very valuable piece of real estate in London. We produced the master plan, and the critical thing about the master plan here, between the two railways, was to come up with an urban form which reconciled the areas either side, but which deliberately retained the historic fabric. Very important historic fabric, 19th century railways, granaries, warehouses. And the developer was very, very keen to retain these, and the master plan was deliberately drawn up to try and make sense of them within a new piece of city. The scheme is now half built, and interestingly enough, for what is medium density, low rise, inner city commercial development, a mix of housing, residential, anchored by a new university. Because the work was done in the master plan to create a place very early on in the development process, what has happened is the headline rents are 80% higher than anticipated 5 years ago when construction started. So commercially, it's being hugely successful. And strangely, it's also publicly very, very popular and is seen as probably one of the key developments in redefining how we strike the balance between commercial development and residential areas, and critically, how we integrate new development socially and economically with the surrounding areas and spread the benefits to some of the more deprived communities. And then finally, in the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to look at micro projects. For a number of years, I ran Design for London, which was the Mayor of London's architectural studio. We became very interested in small-scale interventions, how we could do very, very simple, small-scale things to try and change areas. We became interested in incremental urbanism and temporary urbanism. We became interested in how you could sort of take a piece of city apart, a bit like a watch in the days when you could take watches apart, and then how you could put them back together again and try and make them work better. We became very interested in a methodology where we worked with valuing what's there, work within what was possible, and try to define and do the small things that were missing to put a neighborhood on a different tack towards improvement. Most of our work was done through design charrettes with local people. We moved our design teams out into the neighborhoods where we worked. And we spent 3 or 4 weeks working, arguing, discussing, drawing, to try and actually produce schemes which emerge from the communities they're supposed to serve. We recognize that in an intensifying densification strategy for a city, housing had to be of a high standard. So we produced a new policy framework to make sure we've got high-quality standards in housing. Not just floor space standards, we looked at aspect, we looked at floor-to-ceiling heights, we looked at design qualities to produce good quality housing. And then we produced a whole series of strategies around public space and public realm, which the mayor adopted. We looked at transforming streets, taking some of the cars out. This is Kensington by the great museums, which has just been transformed into a shared surface. Elsewhere, we moved into some of the kind of more deprived areas and created space out of places like this, transforming them into new civic spaces. We looked at temporary interventions around play and activity. which could make a very, very significant change in the way people saw their neighborhoods. And we worked with people to do a whole series of temporary installations. This was a student project which ran one summer, producing a bar, about $7,000 for the entire project. It ran for the summer. It used the top of an old car park. And then finally, we became more and more interested in how, as designers, you curate the city, how you choreograph space. We recognize that design doesn't stop when you complete the drawings. It doesn't stop when the contractor leaves site. And increasingly, we moved back and we worked very, very intensively with communities around how spaces could work. In this case, just putting soft play area into a public space to increase the usage. To finish, I was very intrigued by the first poll that we did this morning, when there was a predominance of support for the idea of strong leadership and strong government. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I think one thing I would stress is whatever you do, there has to be room. Cities have to make space for the unexpected. They have to make space for people to do things like this in a way the city planning could never do. And that is probably the message I want to leave you with. Thank you very much.